let's talk about what have you seen go wrong with incentive setting? Where have you seen some pitfalls? What would you recommend people avoid? And then we can get into how to do it right.
You've got to make sure that your sellers realize that they are selling consumption increase in value of the relationship.
Co-selling and crafting a successful partner revenue management strategy poses a significant challenge. It's like walking a tightrope, trying to balance cooperation and healthy competition with your partners. You want to grow together, but not at each other's expense. Figuring out fair incentive systems and aligning goals for a strong partnership that boosts revenue often feels like solving a puzzle without all the pieces. And not to mention the fear of making mistakes and the need for a clear strategy add to the pressure. What is the key strategy for combating this pain point? Greg Sarafin, the global managing partner of Ernst & Young Alliance ecosystem, knows a thing or two about the power of strategic partnering. In this episode of the Run Revenue Show, Greg shares the importance of setting clear goals, establishing strategic partnerships, and shifting revenue models towards consumption subscription models. Stay tuned throughout the full episode to hear how Greg used strategic partnering to run revenue like a pro.
I'm Kyle Coleman, sales pro turned SVP of marketing at Clary. Run Revenue is the show where revenue pros learn to stop revenue leak, achieve revenue precision, and grow their companies and careers.
This is Run Revenue Show with Kyle Coleman.
Welcome, everybody, to today's episode of the Run Revenue Show. I am so excited to be joined today by Greg Sarafin, the global managing partner of EY Alliance Ecosystem and fashion icon. Greg, how you doing today?
I'm good. I'm really enjoying the fashion icon thing. Never thought I was one. Sadly, I've put a lot of stuff on LinkedIn, on EY.com and elsewhere that's very thoughtful. And I post one picture of me in yellow EY cover, and I have the highest social engagement I ever had in the history of posting anything. It changed my strategy, apparently.
Today, we are talking all about, as you might guess, how to get co-selling right and how to think about a partner revenue management strategy. But before we do that, though, Greg, you've had a long, storied career. Tell us a little bit about your background and tell us about your current role.
My career is now so long, I will not tell you about all of it because we'll just blow the entire podcast on that. No one wants to hear about my career anyway, let's be honest. Here's what I'll tell you that's relevant to your audience. For the last 20 years, I have primarily been in revenue roles, primarily in professional services. A lot of them have been direct revenue roles. At IBM, I was absolutely in a revenue role for a financial services, piece of the financial services organization there. I started in EY as revenue, but 6 years ago, I went over to the dark side. That's what I said at the time, was the dark side. What I perceived to be, quote, indirect revenue. I was saying at EY, you sometimes you get voluntold to do things. And I was voluntold to step into the partner ecosystem function. At the time, we called it alliances. We didn't even know what to call it back then. And so I inherited something that wasn't structured as a business or a function in a form or fashion. It was just a lot of best efforts from people all over the place. There was no transparency in the cost. There was no definition of business process, let alone the ability to improve process every year. There's no way to measure the benefit, how much of what we were doing was actually incremental revenue from the perception of the organization versus how much of it we would have had anyway. Coming from that revenue officer mindset, I decided, okay, let me rethink the whole way we're doing this. And also, since we at EY were way behind the curve, we were a $33 billion company 6 years ago with only $1 billion in partner revenue, which we were severely lagging our peer group. That's why I got voluntold, because somebody woke up one day and realized, wow, that's probably a gap we should address. It turned out it was. Anyway, long story short, we put together a strategy that really said, look, we're going to treat this like a business function on par with finance, on par with talent, on par with tax, IT. It's going to be a function. Because it's a function, we're going to run it like a function. So we're going to hold ourselves accountable to KPIs to prove to ourselves and our shareholders ultimately that we are adding value to the enterprise. So we defined all the business processes that we are responsible for as the stewards. Of course, business processes across all the other functions of the company as well. We had a lot of change management to do, Kyle, because inserting a whole new function and a whole new set of processes that touch all the other functions, they got to change their processes as well, particularly the revenue function, which I know we're going to talk about a lot on this podcast. And then also we would go to market differently than the 40-year history in our particular industry of how our peers have gone to market, which has largely been to form alliances with big tech companies. And of course, you're a tech company, so you know that tech companies, in order to get adoption of their technology, really ultimately need business users to use it to improve their business performance, which is what provides the business case to pay for the tech, or more importantly, to pay for the renewal or the continued consumption, because that's where a lot of tech companies, they might make that initial sale, but if the business users don't get the value, they ain't making the repeat sale. That's not happening. And I know you guys know this because you're really good at it. The point is we created the function, we did the change management, and we created a go-to-market strategy that was very different. We don't partner with SAP and with Oracle and with Workday, 3 ERPs, to do ERP work. We do finance transformation work for our clients. We help the finance function get to a better outcome, to run the financer so they can help the business run better. And so we have hand selected the partners we have in that solution set that we've developed: SAP, Microsoft, BlackLine, UiPath, et cetera. And we have an offering that's not about the individual tech platforms and competing them against each other like our competitors do, but we have an offering that's complete, it's pre-integrated, it's faster time, lower risk, et cetera. That is a little bit different as well. And then I work with my counterparts on the direct revenue side to make sure that we are appropriately accounting for what's incremental to our overall revenue. And also we're being accountable for our contribution to revenue, which is built into our strategic plan every year.
In the last 6 years, you have grown pretty significantly. What has been the growth rate?
So we've had a 40% CAGR. So we've doubled every 2 years, basically. We have been 40% of the growth of EY overall. So EY has grown to 50 billion, so 17 billion in growth. 7 of that growth was partner ecosystem revenue, incremental revenue. And we're an audit firm, so there's a big chunk of our business where we can't do partnering at all. If you were to firewall them away, the numbers are even larger. It's over 50% of our growth has been from partnership. But more importantly, because that always sounds good, we view this as a co-innovation, co-investment model first and foremost. We're creating net new capabilities for our customers that don't exist. We're typically not just working with one partner, we're working with multiple partners to bring them together on a platform to create capabilities wrapped by EY services and EY IP that a customer can't get elsewhere. And that's part of the reason that we've had this growth. And one of the ways I measure the success of what we're doing is how much investment we're getting from our partners. And this year we will get over $100 million of investment capital from our partners to do co-innovation, co-development, and so forth. So that's one measure that I think is really important, because to get $100 million in investable capital at any company, you got to sell about, depending on your revenue to margin ratio, 5x or more of that in revenue in order to get that investable capital. So that's pretty substantial for us. So that's one thing that's really important. The other thing that's important is client impact. Not all revenue is equal. If your clients are using Clary in a way that's not optimal, they're not really helping themselves. They're not getting a return on capital and the investment they made in your platform. And the same thing is true of services. If we're doing services that are not really moving the needle for our client, it's just tactical things that are answering the mail, things they need to get done, we're not benefiting the way we should be benefiting our clients either. And so the other thing we look at is the portfolio of things that we bring to our clients. Are they impactful? Would we be able to look in the mirror and say, yep, we helped that client do something really important, material, and transformational to help them on their business journey? And a lot of what we do falls into that category.
It's very impressive, Greg. Congrats on all the success. And I think it's pretty safe to say that you have a pretty damn good idea of what good looks like from a partner revenue management process standpoint. And you've mentioned a handful of hallmarks. You've mentioned treating it like a revenue management function. You've mentioned the clarity and governance you need to really run that function well, starting first and foremost with customer value, the co-innovation, co-investment, all those sorts of things. Any other hallmarks of what good looks like? Any other things you'd point out for people that are trying to sharpen their skills here?
One piece of advice is don't partner with everybody strategically. Look, partnerships take a lot of different shapes. And for many companies, partnerships depends on the industry. And I know you're covering a lot of industries on this podcast in terms of our listeners. Up here in the consumer products industry, typically you think of partnering first and foremost as co-branded relationships. And if you're in the energy industry or other capital intensive industries, you're looking at partnership more through a lens of business development and joint ventures, shared capital risk, shared capital benefit. If you're in technology, you're looking for the model that I already described, which is to get partnered with GSIs and boutiques and ISVs to expand the surface area of your product to market and also the business value that can be extracted from your product. Depends on the industry you're in, where your predominant mindset is and actual partnering motions are. However, if you want to do strategic partnering, that's a different thing. And that's what we decided we would do. We said, look, the way we're going to think about this is EY is like every other industry. Professional services like every industry, I should say. Every industry is pivots take decades. We're well into it though. From the products and services they traditionally have offered the market to realizing they really need to provide an outcome, a business value outcome for their client or customer, and need to wrap that in a superior experience, both a people experience as well as a digital experience. And let's take an example, automobile industry, vehicles. Are we going to sell vehicles to consumers 10, 15, 20 years from now? Probably not. We're probably going to sell a mobility experience to consumers. But the vehicle you need will show up when you need it. It'll be the right vehicle for the purpose that you're using it. Could be a van if you have a lot of people. Could be a sports car if you just want to take a ride. Could be a pickup truck if you want to move some stuff. It may or may not have a driver. It may or may not be self-driving. But the point is, you will purchase a mobility experience. Well, that's a value outcome that's quite extraordinary. And it's a huge leap from selling vehicles. And so we looked at our business the same way and said, look, what are we in the future? And the answer is we are helping clients to orchestrate their business outcomes, right? Whether it's an outcome around risk management. So instead of going in and helping them with their tax compliance and with their tax optimization, taking on the burden of doing that on their behalf and selling them the outcome of compliant tax filings optimized to reduce tax burden and improve cash flow. That's just one example of how we think about the future of our business. And then we think about all of our clients in the industries they serve and what's the future of their business, thinking about what is the value outcome that you ultimately are going to participate in as a company versus where you are today. And then once you start to think about what that looks like, you realize you don't have enough time or capital to get there. You need to partner to get there. And you need to partner in a different way than you've historically partnered. It's not co-branding. It's not JVs. It's not any other model that you've been used to. This is strategic development of co-branded, co-innovated, co-developed, integrated, co-marketed, co-sold value propositions that drive value outcomes for end clients. And you can either choose to participate in that, or you can be a supplier, whoever ultimately does orchestrate that value in whatever industry you're serving. I know that was a long-winded way of saying that we said, look, where's our business going? Where are our clients' businesses going? Partnering needs to look very different. It needs to be at a different scale, and it needs to be at a different level of efficiency and effectiveness. And so let's design a set of business processes that get us there first. That's what we decided to do. And so then getting back to your original question, start small. We started with just 2 partners to get it right, SAP and Microsoft. We got it right with them. We're 80th percentile. It's an ongoing improvement process. You're never done. You know that you're continuously improving every year, arguably every quarter, how you prosecute your business function if you really want to stay competitive. So we're constantly improving, but we started with just 2 strategic partners. Then we added 2 more, them and ServiceNow. Now we have several more, Dell, Snowflake, UiPath. We're building the same model with them. It has characteristics of a joint venture. I call it a virtual joint venture because it's not actually a joint venture because that's like wearing cement shoes. But we create a governance model. We create a shared organizational structure, a shared governance model, shared accountability model, shared marketing and branding. It's a model that's quite extraordinary. And then we take those models and then we put an orbit around them, smaller partners. In your world, you would call them ISVs. Kyle, you know that term. And so smaller partners to then orchestrate these value propositions. And with that model, but again, forget our industry, start small, figure out what strategic partnering means in your industry, who are your key strategic partners that you're going to put an orbit of other partners around, because that's the key. You want to create those centers of gravity around which you can then circulate the rest of the partners that you're going to involve in whatever ultimate value outcome you're trying to orchestrate.
It's such an excellent framework, Greg. And I think a lot of people, when they're thinking about partnerships, they do the inverse of what you just described. They trot out the old dusty partner playbook. They blow it up, they open it up, and they just expect the same plays from 30 years ago to work today. But what you're saying is, no, you need to have a vision for what the value outcomes are that you're driving. Take a 15-year leap into the future and really think about your industry and think about what your customers are going to want or demand at that time, and then work backwards to find a solution, understanding that you don't have the resources or capital to do it yourself, and you likely need to strategically partner with the right folks to go and make that vision a reality. That's a really powerful way of thinking about it.
So far, it's working. I don't just mean the revenue growth. That's the easy thing to measure, but it's all the other KPIs that we measure underneath of that are the real indicator. There's a correlation between the strategy, the growth, and then the lower level KPIs that indicate that the two are connected. Otherwise, it could just be a happy accident.
What are some of those KPIs?
I gave you one of them. How much co-investment capital do we get from our partners? Another one is how much co-sell motion do we get from our partners relative to single sell? So I said we have a finance transformation offering that involves a bunch of partners with SAP and the GL at the center. In most instances, we are co-selling with those partners, but there are some instances where we're not. We're selling against, I'll use SAP, has another preferred partner at a particular client, and they'll co-sell with that competitor. And our win rate when that happens goes way down. Heuristically, we can't track it exactly. It's one of the few KPIs we haven't figured out how to track really exactly yet, but we do surveys and so forth to get at the answer. In round numbers, when we sell against the co-sell motion, we win 20 points lower. Our win rate is 20 points lower. Versus when we co-sell and nobody else is co-selling, our win rate is 20 points higher. It's a 40-point swing in win rate. If you're a CRO, you know what that means. I don't need to explain that to you as an audience. It's massive. When you co-invest, co-market, and co-sell, that's what's unlocked the ability to double in 2 years, is that plumbing all that together. So that's a KPI we looked at very carefully. How often do we co-sell versus not co-sell? And what's the win rate swing when we do versus when we're selling against? Then there's other things that we also measure, Kyle, because we believe that every function needs to be a good steward of the business and needs to manage its costs versus its business benefit to maximize the business benefit, maximize earnings. Partnership relationships are really expensive in overhead. Let me just state that up front. You put a lot more calories into a partnership with Microsoft than you do selling to them as a client, or they do selling to you as a client. In our Microsoft relationship, we manage all those things plus social good in one thing. In fact, all of our strategic partners are also clients and providers to us. And when we meet with them, we talk about the totality of the value we create in the relationship. We don't meet with them separately as a client, separately as a vendor, and separately as a partner. But coming back to the overhead of managing these relationships is quite high. So you need to pick them carefully, going back to don't do a whole bunch of them. And you need to do it really efficiently. So what we've done is we separate our front office processes, which is the marketing and the go-to-market sort of activities, sales, co-selling, et cetera, from the middle and back office and compliance and regulatory driven things, the G&A and SG&A. We've moved all of that into a leveraged global delivery model. We've spent over $10 million building a platform on top of ServiceNow, Microsoft, UiPath, and some other technologies, automate every single process. We created a function. We defined all the processes for the function. We then put a risk and control framework because we're regulated. Even if we weren't regulated, we still have a risk and control framework because partnerships have more risk as well, because if the company you're partnering with screws something up at a client, your reputational risk at the client causes you to write a check, potentially, depending on the client relationship. And you also could have general reputational risk if somebody you partner with does something that is viewed by the public or government as negative. We've got a whole risk and controls framework. We've digitized all our processes. We put the risk and controls into it. We've moved it into a global delivery model. And we've driven the cost of that down to less than 10 basis points of the revenue we generate. So we generate $8 billion in revenue, and all of our middle back office and compliance functions, we deliver them for $6 million this year. So that's one thing that we really take a close look at. And then the other is for our strategic relationships, how much growth do we get this year? how much did that translate into earning? Because when we look at the front office side, all we really care about is, are we generating earnings growth? Not even sales growth. So we're a little different than a revenue officer, perhaps, in that we're really focused on the margin. We're focused on both, but the margin is what we really look at. So this year, we'll spend about $70 million for that handful of strategic relationships we have. And all the relationship handlers and go-to-market and I was out here at Dell Tech World this week. We pay for Dell Tech World. We paid for Sapphire in Orlando last week. So all that expense for all these client events and everything else, round numbers, that was about $70 million this year. And we'll generate close to $400 million in earnings growth. So for every dollar that we spent on cost of sales, because I put all that into cost of sales, yes, and SG&A, we're returning over $5 of earnings growth to our shareholder, which in our case is the partners that own the member firms, because we're partnership. So these are things that you need to think about right out the gate and start measuring, because if you don't measure them and think about them, your costs could get very high very quickly. And then people will point to the cost and not the benefit. You don't want that.
Let's go back to something you said. You mentioned that 40-point swing in the win rates that you have when you co-sell versus when you don't co-sell. And yes, the CROs listening to this are very aware, because that swing means the difference between keeping their job or losing their job. So it's a big swing. I've heard you say, Greg, that you're thinking about all these things: co-innovation, co-investment, co-development, co-marketing, co-selling. And I've heard you say that the hardest part is actually the co-selling. And you even said it doesn't matter how much executive intent there is. If you don't get co-selling right, the whole system falls apart. Talk to us a little bit about that.
That's more of a B2B statement than a B2C statement. B2C, a little more nuanced. I'm in a B2B business. A lot of my clients, I'm providing B2B services to them. I make clear for our B2C customers that, there's a bit of a filter you have to put on this. Now, you talked about executive intent. So if you manage a relationship well, and you start by defining a common purpose, a joint branding value proposition that underpins that purpose that your marketing people agree to, you define a set of solutions and a set of sectors. You don't want to boil the ocean. What are you going to major in across both sector and in terms of the values that you're going to sell each year? You got to think of this as a portfolio, right? The first year of that relationship, you pick a couple of solutions and a couple of sectors. Then you have a couple more solutions the next year with a few more sectors. And every time you've built up a portfolio, because you got to be patient, you're building that new set of products effectively. And it takes time to do that. All those things are, I would put in the relatively easy to do. If you do it well, you have a willing counterparty. So you all see the value proposition of doing what you're doing strategically. It all can fall apart in the field, particularly in the B2B field, because we all know in a B2B business, account teams are very protective of their client relationship. And most field sellers are very protective of making their quarterly goals. That could be a challenge, because when you put a couple of field sellers together, each of whom has a different compensation model, each of whom's on a different quarterly close cycle for something that might ultimately have to be joined on a common close cycle or sales cycle, it can get really tricky. You also have personal bias that enters into it. No CEO of any company can tell the field seller at some account somewhere that thou shalt do this. They could, but they wouldn't get very far with that strategy, would they? Or the chief revenue officer for that matter. But you can say, hey, listen, these are the types of motions that we're going to focus on. These are the products we're going to spiff you on, blah, blah, blah. You can do things to modify their behavior generally, but individually meddling on a case-by-case basis with your AEs and Salesforce don't work, not very well. Getting field sellers to co-sell together effectively, there are a lot of hurdles to it, starting with personality, bias, misaligned plans. They didn't get the memo that the joint value proposition is part of the strategic set of initiatives at both companies. There are all these things that can creep in. And then when you get into a lot of what we do now is we have multi-party value propositions where you could have multiple sellers technically attached to a deal. Then it gets even harder. Although, spoiler alert, we never do multi-party selling. We always define our sales motions. So there's a lead motion, there's a motion lead. It's often us because we're selling business outcomes to the business buyer. It's not always us, but it's often us. And then it's usually our strategic partner is in the number 2 seat. Sometimes we'll flip that, depending on the nature of the sale and who we're selling to. And then when we're adding what I call the ISVs around in that value proposition, generally they're on deck to share the relationship capital and make sure that whoever their buyers are leaning in on the value proposition, but in a very targeted and controlled fashion, that everybody's on the same message and nobody's selling against the outcome. Because you'd be shocked, maybe you wouldn't be shocked. You probably wouldn't be shocked. Your audience probably won't be shocked either. How many times you find out that, we thought we were selling this deal together, and then we find out the AE at such and such account was doing his own little parallel sales motion. It was essentially saying, you don't really need to do that. Just do this. Don't underestimate the calorie burn. I will call them controls because, again, you can't control field sellers. It's a really bad idea. The incentives and the governance and the communication. It's really a massive change management exercise. It's helping the sellers see that, yes, the value proposition, you will do better long-term and short-term. You might have to define what short-term looks like. And in some cases, we work with counterparties to either give quota relief in a particular quarter because the deal really belongs in another quarter in order to maximize the value for everybody. Although, again, you can't do too much of that. That's a lot of calories. But more importantly, we get higher spiffs if you sell it the strategic way versus if you sell it the tactical way. And you're increasingly seeing CRO organizations and customer success organizations do that because, again, the pivot, it's still important to have revenue optimization in the quarter. But for most companies, you need your renewals because everybody's pivoting to a consumption outcome model. So even if today you think you're just selling something, you're walking away, you're not. Right. And if you want the long-term value of that customer relationship, you want to maximize that. Working with partners is important, but that means as a CRO, you need to start to communicate differently with your account executives in particular, as well as your solution sellers that, hey, listen, we're more focused on long-term value customer success. We're going to change how you're compensated a bit to make that a more palatable thing for you. Because it's BS to say, hey, this is the strategic direction of the company, but we're still going to compensate you the way we've done for the last 20 years, which is hyper tactical. So these are the messages that I hope that our audience can internalize. Is one, I would recommend that you don't own the partnering function. It is a very different function. It should be accountable to you for revenue production, which is how we do it at EY. I'm accountable for a number to our revenue functions. But because there's so much unique about what we do, we set it up as a separate function to prosecute those processes. It's a joint revenue function, or it's a multi-party revenue function. And it's a co-investment, co-product development, co-innovation function. It's a bit of a unicorn in the traditional functional alignment of most companies.
It's really interesting, Greg. I want to double click on incentives. Most of our listenership are B2B CROs, revenue leaders, and things like that. And I think it was Charlie Munger who said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes. So let's talk more about those incentives, because that's really what a lot of this comes down to. It's human nature. It's seller behavior. You can't change it. So you've got to play the game the right way. But first, let's talk about what have you seen go wrong with incentive setting? Where have you seen some pitfalls? What would you recommend people avoid? And then we can get into how to do it right.
One common mistake I see is where you're putting together a value proposition that could end up the end client's estate, or could end up in a different estate. Let me make it real. So we have some tax clients who split the technology stack that we use to do tax outsourcing into their Azure estate. But a lot of them are like, no, I don't either have Azure. I don't want it in my Azure estate. You keep it in your Azure estate, EY. It used to be that the Microsoft sellers were like, wait a minute, I don't get paid. The EY rep gets paid, but I don't get paid. So what you have to do is in models like that, MSP models or CSP models, for those that know those acronyms, right? Managed service provider, cloud service provider models, you got to make sure that the cloud seller is getting compensated, quota relief, whether the end client adopts it or whoever's hosting it adopts it. And so you have to fix the compensation model, or you'd be shocked how many times that comes up. So that's one big mistake you got to realize that you have to make sure your sellers get quota relief no matter where the final product ends up being built. Okay. So that's one. Another is you've got to make sure that your sellers realize that they are selling consumption an increase in the value of the relationship. That's what they're selling. They're not selling transactions anymore. And if you're measuring them on deal and on SKUs, you're not really going to see an ability to effectively partner at scale. I certainly see many companies where they still incent their field sellers to sell transactions, whether they're services or products, and walk away and not care about the long-term value of the client. They're just churning deals. So hopefully most of the people listening to this aren't that mindset and would resonate with, you got to change your incentive plan to sell quarterly over quarter increase in the value, the total value of the relationship between the parties. Then another thing is you really need to do the education, and it has to come from the C-suite, and it has to flow down through two channels. It has to flow down through the geography channels, because pretty much every company that's in B2B has a geography cut to the P&L, and often in their code block, it's the primary cut. But then, of course, the secondary cut is the product or solution or service line cut. And so you need to make sure that message is coming down through each of those flows from the C-suite. So it comes in both the left ear and the right ear of the account executives, because they can have selective hearing, but when they're hearing in both ears, it's harder to claim they didn't hear it. And you got to say, look, our strategy as a company is to generate X% of our revenue from partners by this date. And it is also to pivot Y% of our revenue from pushing in or selling transactions to consumption / subscription / repeatable revenue mechanisms for RevRec. You got to set those goals. You got to make it very clear top down. You got to declare who your strategic partners are, what your strategic solutions are. They have to come top down, so that when you're showing up, you're not just showing up and saying, okay, EY and Microsoft rep or EY and UiPath rep, let's get at it at your account. They're not surprised when you come and tell that to them. In fact, ideally, they go find each other. Well, hey, we should get together and try to sell this thing. That's the ideal outcome. You want a pull model at the account, not a push model. And that's the final thing I would say. If you don't get to a pull model, it doesn't happen overnight. But if you don't get to a pull model at your account, the calories you will burn to try to get teams to co-sell is going to be unduly high, and you will not get the percentage of co-sell you need to get that 50% win rate versus the 10% win rate, assuming your traditional win rate is 30%. That's the final thing I would point out. You got to get the pool model. The account teams got to know their job is to figure out what strategically we're selling for long-term value, and they need to go figure out how to pull in the right resources to do it.
Really well said, Greg. Thank you so much. This has been outstanding. I want to be mindful of your time. I have one last bonus question for you, which is very curious to hear your answer to this. I'm curious to hear about a book, or maybe multiple books, that have had a big impact on you, on your life, or on your career. Anything pop out?
I was asked that question on another podcast recently. And I was thinking of book A, and I used the title of book B, but I talked about book A. So now you've given me a chance to
set the record straight.
Or do-over, set the record straight. Jeff Saviano, if you're listening to this, which you probably will at some point, what I meant to say when you asked me that exact same question was Flowers for Algernon, not Of Mice and Men, which are two very different books, two very good books. And the impact that had on me at a very young age, meaning Flowers for Algernon, is, look, don't ever assume that any gift that you've either been given or that you've developed, either on purpose or by accident, is a gift you're going to keep. So be constantly vigilant and appreciative for what you have, and value what you have, and do your best to keep growing and keep improving. That book had a huge impact on me, and maybe it was an outsized impact. I don't know, but it's nice that I remember the title this time. But that's a big bonus. The other thing I would say in terms of books, I read so much email. I do enjoy the occasional business framework book. I won't mention any of my names. You guys, everybody knows these things. Every year, another batch of them come out, usually from like Jeff Moore and those folks. But I do think that there are good insights to be gleaned by those books. I just wish I could get the 10-page PowerPoint version of those books because, quite honestly, a lot of them are just 10-page PowerPoints. They're good.
There you go. Really good stuff. Where can people go to find out more about you, find out more about, if they don't know about EY, and any particular resources you'd point people toward?
I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. You got my name posted here. So you search for me, you'll find me. I post a lot. So if you just look at the things I've posted in my profile, you'll very quickly get to those items as well as get back to ey.com, which is where most of my content is. If you go to ey.com/alliances or ey.com/partner ecosystem, you'll get to the page, which has all of our thought research. We've done a lot of studies. We've actually worked with third parties to do studies that have demonstrated that there is a trend about what I was saying earlier, that partnering models are now starting to build and buy models for value creation. So you might find some valuable information there if you're having trouble convincing the rest of your C-suite colleagues that partner models should be something that are more prevalent in how you conduct your business.
Great stuff. Greg Sarafin, Global Managing Director of the EY Alliance Ecosystem. Thank you so much for the time, Greg.
Don't let what you heard today go to waste. Take 2 minutes to download today's checklist to get your priorities in line for the week. You can find that linked in our show notes. And if you liked what you heard, make sure you give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. We'll be back next Monday with more to help you win your week.